High above the ground, a woman flung a small puppy into the air. Fortunately, the puppy had a parachute strapped to its back. It turned out this wasn't a cruel act, but a daring performance. The crowd below gasped, then erupted in applause and cheers. Energized by their reaction, the woman pushed things even further. She climbed onto the edge of the hanging basket, grabbed a rope, and swung her entire body out into the open air, thrilling and terrifying the audience beneath her. This wasn't just for show, she was performing stunts to win over the audience, hoping their excitement would turn into financial support. Without their sponsorship, there would be no funding for their high-altitude explorations. The woman was no amateur, she was an experienced pilot. Beside her stood a man, a meteorologist passionate about weather science. The year was 1862, a time when humans had no airplanes or helicopters. If you wanted to study the skies or predict the weather, your only option was to climb aboard a hot air balloon. Not long ago, the man had given a public speech claiming that weather could be forecasted scientifically, something many dismissed as pure fantasy. So for him, this ascent into the heavens was more than just an adventure. It was the realization of a lifelong dream, but nothing could have prepared them for what would follow. As the balloon climbed higher, it reached 1,600 meters. The man diligently recorded changes in altitude and temperature, sending his data back to the ground using homing pigeons. Then the balloon rose into a thick layer of cloud. They were suddenly surrounded by blinding white fog, unable to see a thing. Out of nowhere, the sky erupted with lightning and thunder. Violent winds whipped around them. A storm was coming.
We need to batten down. Please put on your wet weather clothing.
The woman urged the man to pack up and prepare for the worst, but he was completely absorbed in collecting his data. He ignored the danger. A savage gust hit the balloon, hurling it sideways and nearly flipping it over. In desperation, the woman began preparing to toss out the man's heavy equipment to lighten the load and help them rise above the storm. But to the man, those instruments were priceless, more important than life itself. He refused to let her touch them. Another furious gust sent both of them flying into the air. They clung to the ropes with all their strength, narrowly avoiding being thrown overboard. Then the balloon suddenly dropped. The man was thrown back into the basket by the momentum, but the woman wasn't so lucky. She landed outside it, dangling in the void. He scrambled to his feet and grabbed her hand, holding on with everything he had. After a struggle, he managed to pull her back in. With no time to rest, the woman began throwing out everything heavy and tied herself to the basket with a safety belt, clutching it tightly as the storm raged on. Eventually, the turbulence subsided. They broke through the clouds and were greeted by sunlight. Together, they patched up the damaged ropes and continued their ascent. When they reached 5,000 meters, they were stunned to see butterflies flying in pairs beside them, an unexpectedly romantic sight at such an altitude. Then the balloon soared to 7,000 meters. The temperature had plummeted to -6 degrees Celsius, and even their instruments began to freeze. The man, obsessed with going higher, hadn't even brought warm clothing. The woman warned him that going further meant certain death from the cold. She moved to descend, but the man refused. Every meter of altitude, every data point, he felt it all mattered. Their disagreement turned into a heated argument. As the woman reached for the vent valve to release gas and lower the balloon, the man stopped her. He looked up at the sky and said, "What could be more mysterious than the stars above?" She paused, gazing at the dazzling canopy of stars. Something in her softened. Eventually, they climbed to 8,000 meters. The temperature dropped to a brutal -20 degrees Celsius. The man hadn't anticipated how dry the air would become. His hands were so frozen he couldn't even control them properly. He took out a homing pigeon to release more data, but the bird was too stiff to fly. It plummeted down like a rock. When he checked the final pigeon, he found it had already frozen to death. Still, the man insisted on reducing weight to ascend even higher. The woman shouted at him to stop. If they kept going up, the balloon wouldn't be able to handle the pressure and would rupture, but the man had no intention of stopping. As she rushed forward to stop him, he shoved her to the ground. In the struggle, a few drops of blood landed on the woman's face. It turned out the man was already suffering from hypoxia, and his nose had started bleeding. The woman warned him that if they didn't descend immediately, he would die. She then spoke of a past accident she'd had with her husband while flying a balloon. Back then, her own stubbornness led to the balloon bursting and plummeting. They had frantically thrown out weight, but it wasn't enough. In a desperate act, her husband jumped out to reduce the load, sacrificing himself so she could live. Hearing her story, the man finally apologized and agreed to descend. But when the woman tried to pull the vent valve, She discovered it was frozen solid and wouldn't budge. Meanwhile, the man was growing weaker by the second, barely able to stand as hypoxia took hold. Now their only option was for the woman to climb to the very top of the balloon at 10,000 meters in minus 20 degrees Celsius temperatures with no safety gear. She gripped the ropes and began climbing toward the top. Her hands were bleeding from the effort, but she kept going. The release valve up top was frozen shut and the balloon was still ascending. If they couldn't make it descend soon, they would freeze to death. Halfway up, she encountered a thick layer of ice covering the balloon's surface. The thin air made breathing difficult, and to keep herself from passing out, she tied a rope around her waist and pressed on. After relentless effort, she finally reached the top. Using her elbow, she tried to smash the release valve open, but it wouldn't budge. She slowly stood up and kicked it with all her might. A rush of gas burst out. To keep the valve from freezing again, she jammed her shoe into it, crouched down, and cut the laces with a knife. Slipping her foot out, she used the knife handle to wedge the shoe tightly into the valve. Her task complete, she collapsed from exhaustion. The constant venting of gas finally caused the balloon to begin its descent, but the vibration from the venting made her unconscious body start to slide. When she regained consciousness, she realized she was hanging upside down, 10,000 meters in the air. The rope around her waist had saved her life. Terrified, she clutched the rope and screamed for the man, but there was no response from the basket. He lay motionless, his condition unknown. With no one to rely on, she knew it was up to her. Using every last ounce of strength, she began swinging her body back and forth. As the momentum grew, she timed her reach perfectly and managed to grab the edge of the basket, finally pulling herself inside. There was no time to rest. She rushed to check on the unconscious man, calling out his name again and again. At last he stirred and came to. When he saw they were descending and noticed the injuries on the woman's hands, he realized everything she'd done was to save him. He quietly thanked her and pulled out a bottle of aged liquor he'd treasured for years to disinfect her wounds. Just then, snowflakes began to fall. The two sat together in the basket, admiring the beautiful snowfall until something strange happened. The snowflakes stopped mid-air, hanging suspended right in front of them, as if time itself had frozen. Alarmed, the woman jumped up to investigate. Looking around, she saw the surrounding snowflakes were also swirling in place. That's when she realized it wasn't that the snow had stopped, but that their descent had accelerated so much they were falling at the same speed as the snow. The shoe she had jammed into the valve had come loose, causing the gas to leak far too quickly. They both rushed to pull the release valve again, but the shoe dropped and the valve failed to close properly. Now the balloon was descending too fast. At this rate, they were going to crash. Panicked, they began desperately throwing out everything they could, supplies, tools, even their clothes. But it wasn't enough. The ground was rushing up to meet them, and impact was seconds away. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, the man came up with an idea. Grabbing a small knife, he urged the woman to climb up onto the ropes with him. There, they began cutting the cords that held the basket, one by one. It was a terrifying gamble. Finally, with a clean slice through the last rope, the basket dropped like a rock, plummeting toward the ground. But it still wasn't enough. Their descent remained dangerously fast. In a split-second decision, the woman prepared to jump out in an attempt to reduce their combined weight and slow their fall. The man immediately stopped her, yelling that he had another idea. If they cut the ropes at the bottom of the balloon, he explained, the balloon would collapse into itself and act like a giant parachute, slowing them down. The woman thought the plan sounded insane, but the man was firm. If they were going to die, they'd die together, and if they were going to survive, they'd do it together too. Without hesitation, he cut the ropes. Miraculously, the plan worked. The balloon inverted and transformed into a parachute. Their fall slowed dramatically. Clutching each other tightly, they burst into relieved laughter, overwhelmed by the fact that they might actually survive. But their journey wasn't over yet. As the makeshift parachute carried them downward, they headed straight toward a dense forest. With a violent crash, the man hit the ground first. The woman, carried forward by sheer momentum, was dragged for several kilometers before finally coming to a stop. When she awoke from unconsciousness, bruised and bloodied, she cried out for the man. To her relief, he was nearby, injured but alive. Though both were badly hurt, they had miraculously survived the impossible. Supporting each other, they limped home together. Their feat soon made headlines around the world. Not only had they set a new world record for altitude, an astonishing 11,278 meters, but the man had also collected invaluable atmospheric data. His findings confirmed the existence of multiple layers in the atmosphere and laid the foundation for modern weather forecasting. Years later, the two of them would ascend into the skies once more, not for science or fame, but to let nature take them on one last, romantic journey together. The Aeronauts is a 2019 biographical adventure film based on the story of pioneering meteorologist James Glaisher and inspired by his record-breaking 1862 balloon flight to study the atmosphere. I had no prior knowledge of the true events behind it, but watching this film sparked my curiosity to learn more. I also appreciated how it honored the spirit of scientific discovery without forcing a romantic subplot between the main characters. And if you've got acrophobia, this movie will have your palms sweating.